Billionaire's daughter humiliates their maid. Years later, karma strikes in an unbelievable way. Jessica, the spoiled daughter of a millionaire, lived a life of luxury, while Ruth, their maid. Jessica treated Ruth like dirt, barking orders and mocking her at every turn. One day, Jessica sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her voice was sharp. "Ruth, bring my tea, and be quick about it." Ruth hurried up the grand staircase, carefully balancing the tray. Her hands trembled slightly. Jessica's impatience always made her nervous. Just as she reached the top, her foot slipped. Crash! The glass cup shattered, and the tea spilled across the marble floor. Jessica's head snapped up. Her eyes darkened with fury. "You idiot!" she screamed, jumping to her feet. I'm sorry, Ma." Slap! Ruth staggered, her cheek burning. Jessica scoffed. "You can't even carry tea properly. You are completely useless." Ruth bent down, hands shaking as she picked up the broken pieces. Jessica crossed her arms. "That cup was expensive. I'll take it from your salary." Tears welled in Ruth's eyes, but she kept silent. She knew talking back would only make things worse. Jessica's mother, Mrs. Williams, stepped outside, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "What's going on here?" she asked, eyes darting between her furious daughter and the trembling maid. Jessica pointed at Ruth. "She spilled my tea and broke the cup. Can you believe it?" Mrs. Williams sighed. "Ruth, is this true?" Ruth lowered her head. It was an accident, Ma." Jessica scoffed. "An accident? She's just careless. She needs to learn a lesson." She turned to Ruth, her eyes cold. "Kneel. Now." Ruth swallowed hard, hesitating. "Did you not hear me?" Jessica snapped. Slowly, Ruth dropped to her knees, her hands shaking. Mrs. Williams folded her arms, eyes sharp. "Useless girl. You can't do one simple thing right." She glared. "Kneel down and stay there until I say otherwise." Mr. Williams stepped down the stairs, his voice firm. "What's going on here?" His eyes narrowed at Jessica and his wife. "Enough of this." "Ruth, get up now." Mr. Williams frowned. "Why is she kneeling?" Jessica rolled her eyes. "She broke a cup, Dad." "She's useless," Mrs. Williams added. "She needs to learn discipline." He sighed. "She's just a maid, not a slave. Treat her with respect." Jessica scoffed. "So now you're taking her side?" Mrs. Williams hissed. "Unbelievable." Jessica grabbed her mother's hand. "Let's go, Mom." They stormed off, leaving Mr. Williams shaking his head in disappointment. Mr. Williams sighed. "It's fine, Ruth. Get up and go to your room." Ruth wiped her tears, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry, sir." "You don't need to apologize," he said gently. With a heavy heart, Ruth stood up, her eyes glistening, and walked away, silent sobs escaping her lips. Ruth sat on her small bed, her hands shaking as she dialed her mother's number. The moment the call connected, she broke down. "Mama, I can't do this anymore. They treat me like I'm not human," she sobbed. Her mother's tired voice came through. "My child, I know it's hard, but please endure. This job puts food on our table." "But Mama, they slapped me today over a broken cup," Ruth whispered, her voice filled with pain. Her mother sighed deeply. "Ruth, we have nothing. If you leave, how will we survive?" Tears streamed down Ruth's face. "I feel like a prisoner, Mama. I don't know how much longer I can take this." Her mother remained silent for a moment. "Pray, my child. God sees everything." Ruth ended the call, staring at the ceiling. Was this really her fate? Later that evening, Mrs. Williams walked into Jessica's room, her face filled with irritation. "Don't mind your father," she said, sitting beside Jessica. "He always takes the side of those beneath us. But you're my daughter. You do what you want." Jessica smirked. So, I can deal with Ruth however I like? Mrs. Williams nodded. Of course. She's just a maid, nothing more. She should know her place. Jessica's eyes gleamed with mischief. Then I'll make sure she never forgets who she serves. Mrs. Williams chuckled. That girl came from nothing, a filthy, poor background. She's lucky we even let her stay here. Jessica smirked. She should be grateful. Exactly, her mother said, standing. Now, don't let her ruin your mood. Enjoy yourself. With a sly smile, she walked out, leaving Jessica plotting. One day, Jessica prepared excitedly to meet her boyfriend, eager to discuss the grand plans for her upcoming birthday celebration. Dressed in luxury, she stepped out of the grand mansion, her heels clicking against the pavement. Early that day, before Jessica left the house, Ryan's phone rang. He picked up immediately. Hello, Mom? Ryan, my car broke down in the estate. I was heading to see a friend. What? Are you okay? I'm fine, but I need help. Don't worry, I'll send someone to assist you right away. All right, dear, I'll be waiting. Ryan ended the call, quickly texting one of his drivers to go help her, unaware of the drama about to unfold. With a smirk, Jessica slid into her sleek car, revved the engine, and sped out of the estate, unaware that this drive would mark the beginning of an unexpected twist in her life. As Jessica drove down the estate road, the sun shone brightly and everything seemed perfect, until she spotted a car blocking the road ahead. She slowed down, honked twice, and waited. The car didn't move. Her patience wore thin. With an annoyed sigh, she yanked the door open and stepped out, slamming it behind her. What kind of nonsense is this? She muttered, striding toward the stalled vehicle. An elderly woman stood beside it, struggling to open the hood. Sweat dripped from her forehead as she huffed in frustration. Jessica scoffed. Seriously? You pick this road to park your junk? The old woman looked up, startled. Oh dear, my car just stopped. I think it overheated. Give me a moment. Jessica cut her off with a loud groan. A moment? Do you think I have all day? This is a private estate, not some roadside mechanic shop. A few passers-by stopped to watch. One man frowned. Miss? She's elderly. Maybe show some respect? Jessica scoffed. Respect? If she can't afford a working car, she should stay home. The crowd murmured disapprovingly, but Jessica flipped her hair as Jessica kicked the old woman's car in frustration. A sleek black SUV pulled over nearby. A tall man in a suit stepped out. It was her father's manager, Mr. Edwards. His brows furrowed as he approached. What's going on here? Jessica scoffed. This useless car is blocking my way. Mr. Edwards' expression darkened as he recognized her. Jessica, this is wrong. She's an elderly woman. Show some respect. Jessica folded her arms. Respect? Should I carry her car on my head? The gathered onlookers murmured, and Mr. Edwards sighed, shaking his head. Jessica's face twisted in anger as she raised her hand to slap the old woman. Before she could strike, Mr. Edwards grabbed her wrist. Enough, Jessica! This is unacceptable! She yanked her hand away, her eyes burning with fury. How dare you touch me? Do you know who I am? Mr. Edwards remained firm. I know exactly who you are, but this is disgraceful. Frustrated, she stormed back to her car, slammed the door and sped off, tires screeching. Edward turned to the old woman with a sigh. I'm so sorry, ma'am. Please forgive her behavior. The woman shook her head. Such arrogance. Life will teach her. Edward nodded solemnly, then walked back to his car. He started the engine and drove straight to his boss's house, determined to inform him about his daughter's behavior. Edward stepped into the parlor, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Ruth, who was carefully dusting the dining table. Something about her caught his attention, her quiet beauty, the way she moved with grace despite her simple attire. "Good afternoon," he greeted with a warm smile. Ruth looked up, startled. "Good afternoon, sir," she replied softly, lowering her gaze. Edward hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. He placed it gently on the table beside her. "Take this," he said in a low voice. "My number is on it. Call me if you're ever less busy." Ruth's hands trembled slightly. She glanced around anxiously, afraid Jessica or Mrs. Williams might see. "Sir, I don't think..." Edward smiled. "It's just a number, Ruth. No harm in keeping it." After a brief hesitation, she slowly picked it up, tucking it into her apron pocket. Edward then walked over to a chair and sat down, waiting for Mr. Williams. Moments later, Mr. Williams walked in, smiling. "Edward, there you are. Come, let's talk in my study," he said. Edward glanced once more at Ruth before standing up. He knew this wasn't the last time they would talk. While Jessica stepped into the mall, her heels clicking sharply as she made her way to Ryan, who sat with his arms crossed, clearly impatient. Ryan leaned forward. "Jessica, what took you so long? I've been sitting here forever." She sighed dramatically, tossing her bag on the table. "Ugh, you won't believe it. Some car broke down right in the middle of the estate road. I had to wait, and it was so frustrating." Ryan smirked. "And knowing you, I'm sure you handled it with patience and kindness." Jessica rolled her eyes. "Oh, please? I don't have time for nonsense. I told them to move, but of course they were too slow." Ryan chuckled. Classic Jessica. She flipped her hair. "Anyway, let's forget that. We need to talk about my birthday party." While in Mr. Williams' mansion, as Edward stood to leave after his meeting with Mr. Williams, he stole one last glance at Ruth, who was now arranging the table. His heart raced, but he said nothing. Ruth caught his gaze briefly before looking away nervously. With a small smile, Edward stepped out of the mansion. After finalizing the birthday plans with Jessica, Ryan drove home feeling satisfied. As he stepped into the house, he immediately noticed his mother sitting in the parlor, her expression filled with sadness. He frowned and walked over to her. "Mom, what's wrong? You look upset." She sighed, shaking her head. "Ryan, I had a terrible experience today, and while I was waiting for help, a young lady insulted and humiliated me in front of everyone." Ryan's brows furrowed. "What? Who would do such a thing?" His mother exhaled deeply. "She was so rude and full of herself. She acted like she owned the world." Ryan's jaw tightened. "This is unacceptable. Who is she?" His mother hesitated before finally saying, "I didn't get her name, but she drove a luxurious black car." Ryan moved closer to his mother, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mom, I'm so sorry. Please don't let it bother you. You need some rest after everything you've been through." She nodded weakly. "Maybe you're right." After ensuring she was calm, Ryan headed to his room to rest too, while Edward began calling Ruth frequently, and over time, their conversations grew deeper. Slowly, a secret love blossomed between them, hidden from everyone in the mansion. One day, while Ruth was on a call with Edward in her room, she had no idea that Jessica had walked up to her door, pressing her ear against it to listen. As Ruth continued her conversation, Jessica burst into the room, snatching the phone from her hand. "So, you found a lover? You, a poor girl?" she sneered. "Better get up and clean the kitchen." Ruth froze, knowing Jessica's wrath could be worse than she imagined. Jessica's eyes widened as she checked the phone screen. Edward? Her father's manager? Her anger boiled over. "So, you're dating my father's manager? You filthy maid!" she screamed, gripping the phone tightly before smashing it to the floor. The device shattered into pieces. Ruth gasped, stepping back in fear. "Please, Jessica, Before she could finish, Jessica lunged at her, delivering a sharp kick to her face. Ruth collapsed, clutching her cheek as pain surged through her. "That should teach you a lesson." Jessica spat before storming out, her rage still burning as she walked to her room. That evening, as Mr. Williams entered the house, he noticed Ruth kneeling on the floor, scrubbing the tiles. His eyes widened when he saw her swollen face. He quickly walked over and gently held her hand. "Ruth, what happened to you?" he asked with concern. Ruth hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "Sir, it was Jessica," she whispered. Mr. Williams let out a deep sigh, rubbing his forehead. He had expected this. "I'm sorry, Ruth. I know how my daughter can be. Please endure. I will talk to her." Ruth nodded slightly, though pain was still visible in her eyes. Without saying more, Mr. Williams turned away and climbed the stairs to his room, his heart heavy with frustration. As Mr. Williams gently held Ruth's hand, Jessica hid in a corner, secretly snapping photos with her phone. A sly grin spread across her face. "Perfect," she whispered. She planned to show her mother, twisting the story to make it seem like Ruth and her father were having an affair, ensuring her mother would chase Ruth out. As Jessica took a step toward her mother's room, she glanced at Ruth scrubbing the floor. "Useless, poor girl," she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt, before striding past to meet her mother. Jessica barged into her mother's room, clutching her phone tightly. "Mom, come and look at this," she exclaimed, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "What is it, Jessica?" Jessica shoved the phone toward her. "I never believed it, but Dad is cheating on you. With Ruth!" Margaret's eyes widened as she stared at the image of Mr. Williams holding Ruth's hand. "What? Ruth is trying to snatch my husband away?" she hissed, anger flaring in her voice. Jessica smirked. "I knew she was up to no good. I know exactly what to do." Mrs. Williams and Jessica planned to chase Ruth out once Mr. Williams left for work. "Tomorrow morning, she's out for good," Mrs. Williams said firmly. Jessica smirked, knowing Ruth would have no one to defend her. They were determined to make sure she never returned. On the other hand, Ryan sat beside his mother, smiling. "Mom, Jessica's birthday is in 2 days, and I have a big surprise planned." Margaret raised a brow. "Oh? What is it?" Ryan grinned. "I'm going to propose to her." Margaret's eyes widened. "Wow, my boy, you're really becoming a man." She patted his shoulder. "That's a big step." Ryan nodded. "I love her, Mom. I want to spend my life with her." Margaret smiled. "That's wonderful, but I'd like to attend her birthday and meet her for the first time." Ryan hesitated, then nodded. "That sounds like a great idea, Mom." Ryan and his mother began discussing the perfect ring, the venue, and how to make the moment special. They wanted everything to be flawless for Jessica's big day. In Mr. Williams' mansion, Jessica stormed into Ruth's room, flinging open the wardrobe and yanking out her clothes. "Mom, hurry up. Let's get rid of this pest before Dad comes back," she snapped. Mrs. Williams grabbed a suitcase and stuffed Ruth's belongings inside without care. "You think you can steal my husband, you wretched girl?" she hissed. Ruth stood frozen at the doorway, her heart pounding. "Ma, I didn't do anything," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Shut up," Jessica shouted, grabbing Ruth's arm and dragging her toward the front door. Ruth struggled, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Williams flung the door open. "Get out, and don't ever come back." Jessica shoved Ruth out with such force that she stumbled onto the pavement. Her bag landed beside her with a loud thud. "Where am I supposed to go?" Ruth sobbed. Jessica smirked. "Not my problem." The door slammed shut. Ruth sat on the cold ground, shaking. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. As she wiped her tears, a car slowed down nearby. Someone had seen everything. Shivering and lost, Ruth clutched Edward's card, the only hope she had left. With nowhere else to go, she wiped her tears and flagged down a taxi. The sun was high in the sky as she read the address carefully. Ruth finally found Edward's house after following the address on the card. She took a deep breath, wiped her tears, and knocked on the gate. A moment later, Edward stepped out, surprised to see her. "Ruth? What are you doing here?" The sight of him made her break down completely. "Edward, I have nowhere to go," she said between sobs. Edward's expression softened. He stepped closer and held her gently. "Come inside first." He led her into the house and sat her down. She wiped her tears and explained everything, how Jessica and her mother threw her out. Edward sighed, shaking his head. "I can't believe they did this to you." Ruth lowered her head, still sniffling. Edward reached for her hand. "It's okay. You can stay here for as long as you need." Her lips trembled. "Thank you, Edward," he smiled. "You're safe now? Let me get you something to eat." Ruth nodded, still overwhelmed with emotions. Edward stood up and walked to the kitchen. She looked around, finally feeling a sense of safety, though uncertainty still lingered in her heart. While Jessica's long-awaited birthday had finally arrived, the grand hall sparkled with elegance. Golden chandeliers bathed the room in warm light. While Ryan and his mother sat at the event hall, she smiled, thrilled about her son's proposal. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Williams beamed with joy, celebrating their daughter's special day. The host took the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the birthday girl to cut her cake." Jessica beamed with excitement, flipping her hair as she gracefully walked toward the stage in her dazzling red gown. Cameras flashed, and guests cheered as she picked up the knife and sliced through the massive, beautifully decorated cake. The moment the knife touched the cake, the hall erupted in applause. Suddenly, Ryan stepped out from the crowd, his heart pounding. He climbed onto the stage, pulling out a small velvet box. The hall fell silent. Jessica turned, confused, until she saw him drop to one knee. "Jessica," Ryan said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Will you marry me?" Gasps filled the room. Mr. and Mrs. Williams' eyes widened in shock. The guests leaned forward, waiting for Jessica's response. As Jessica stared at the ring, a loud voice echoed through the hall. "No, Ryan, stop!" Everyone turned. Mrs. Margaret stormed onto the stage, eyes blazing. She snatched the mic. "This can't happen," she said, her voice shaking. "Oh, Jessica. I had no idea you were the girl my son has been talking about." Jessica frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret stepped closer. "Do you remember that day a car broke down in the estate? The woman you insulted, humiliated, and kicked? That was me." Jessica's eyes widened in horror. Gasps filled the room. Ryan looked stunned. "Mom!" "What?" Margaret faced him. "You can't marry her. She's rude and heartless." Silence fell. Mr. and Mrs. Williams exchanged embarrassed glances, their faces pale. The guests whispered among themselves, waiting for Jessica's reaction. Mr. and Mrs. Williams stormed out of the event hall, their faces burning with shame. Jessica, overwhelmed with humiliation, ran ahead, tears streaming down her face. The whispers and shocked expressions from the guests haunted her as she hurried to the car. The ride home was tense. Mr. Williams' grip on the steering wheel tightened, his fury barely contained. Jessica sniffled in the back seat, while Mrs. Williams sat in silence, her mind racing. As soon as they reached the house, Mr. Williams slammed the door behind him. He turned sharply, his eyes burning with rage. "Have you seen what you've done to yourself, Jessica?" he bellowed. You ruined your own happiness with your evil character, and you," he pointed at his wife, "you encouraged this. You made her arrogant, cruel, and now both of you have disgraced my name." Mrs. Williams lowered her head, speechless. "I've had enough. I'm divorcing you, and I want you out of my house, both of you." Jessica gasped. "Dad, please." "Don't call me that," he snapped. "Get out, both of you." Mrs. Williams grabbed his arm. "Darling, please don't do this. There's nothing to discuss," he roared. "Leave now." Jessica and her mother hesitated, but when he yanked the door open and pointed outside, they knew he meant it. With tears and shame, they stepped out. The door slammed shut behind them. Mrs. Williams and Jessica stood outside, stranded and helpless. With nowhere to go and Mr. Williams refusing to take them back, reality hit hard. Their downfall had just begun. Over the years, Edward and Ruth's love flourished, leading them to a life of success and happiness. Edward left Mr. Williams's company for Ruth's safety, and together they built a thriving business. Today, they live in luxury, cherishing their journey from struggle to triumph. Mrs. Williams and Jessica's condition worsened. Now homeless, they slept on the streets, struggling to find food and work. Once wealthy, they faced the harsh reality of survival. Jessica and Mrs. Williams wandered into a new area where no one knew them as a millionaire's family. Their clothes were worn, their pride shattered. "Mom, look!" Jessica pointed at a supermarket's job vacancy poster. "They need sales workers. We should apply." Mrs. Williams sighed. "A job in a supermarket? Jessica, we've never worked a day in our lives." Jessica grabbed her mother's hand. "We don't have a choice. We need food and shelter." Reluctantly, Mrs. Williams nodded. Jessica dialed the number on the poster. A voice answered. "Hello, I'm calling about the sales job," Jessica said. "Come to the office for an application," the person replied. Jessica hung up and turned to her mother. "They want us to apply in person." Mrs. Williams swallowed her pride. "Let's go. We have no other option." With heavy hearts, they set off toward their uncertain future. The next day, Jessica and Mrs. Williams arrived at the office, hopeful about securing a job. But the moment they stepped inside, they froze in shock. Sitting at the desk, looking successful and powerful, were Edward and Ruth. Mrs. Williams gasped, gripping Jessica's hand. "No, this can't be." Jessica's face turned pale. "Ruth," she whispered. Ruth stood up, folding her arms. Well, look who we have here, Mrs. Williams and her beloved daughter. Did you think life would always favor you?" Jessica and her mother fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces. "Ruth, please, forgive us," Mrs. Williams pleaded. "We've lost everything." Jessica sobbed. "We were wrong. We're suffering now. Please help us." Edward placed a hand on Ruth's shoulder. "Ruth, let go of the past." Ruth took a deep breath. "Get up," she said. "We'll talk." Ruth sighed and said, "Okay, I'll help, but you won't work here." She handed them an envelope filled with money. "Use this to start a small shop and rebuild your lives." Edward nodded and added more money. "Make good use of it." Jessica and Mrs. Williams wept in gratitude. As they left, Ruth sat in silence, still in shock at their downfall. Edward sighed and said, "That's life. It can change at any moment." Ruth nodded, deep in thought. Ruth and Edward continued living a successful life as their business flourished globally. Meanwhile, Jessica and Mrs. Williams started a small business to survive. They had to rebuild from the ground up, learning the value of kindness and humility through their struggles. Treat others with kindness and respect, regardless of their status. Life is unpredictable. Those you look down on today may be the ones you need tomorrow. Choose kindness, for it always finds a way back to you. What are your thoughts on this story? Share your insights in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and stay connected. Thank you for watching. An exciting new story is coming soon.